What are internal versus external institutions? And of course, an institution is a set of rules, roles, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationships. And institutions include institutions like markets, like marriage, like the legal system, but they also include the corporate ecostructure, but also individual corporations or sort of sub-institutions within the corporate ecostructure institution. So that's institutions. Now, internal versus external. You have to ask internal to what and external to what? And it's basically internal to the human heart and soul and mind. So if it's an enforcement mechanism and a set of rules that are just known by people and enforced by people because it's aligned with their values, that's an internal institution. And of course, the enforcement mechanisms there tend to be social judgment and expectations and social norms and habits and conventions. All of those form just sort of the institutions that are already inside people's heads and people's hearts, their heads and their hearts, and that will be enacted whether or not somebody is out there in an official role enforcing it. And then, of course, external institutions are not automatically built into people's minds and hearts. These are sort of the official hierarchies and official roles with leaders and managers and CEOs who have that very defined role. There's a constitution, the rules are written down, the sanctions are written down, or they're more official in some way. That's an external institution. And of course, organizations are going to have their own set of rules and structures. The Constitution of the United States is a set of external institutions that structure society. But of course, there's going to be a very strong relationship between these. And as a matter of fact, if there's misalignment between the external institutions and the internal institutions in terms of expectations and values, that can be a huge problem. And a lot of institutional change has to do with how do you change the structure here such that the internal institution sort of follows along. Because if the internal institution doesn't match the external institution, that actually invalidates people's willingness to go along with the set of rules and the set of authorities that are set up in the external institution. So as you might imagine, this is more decentralized in terms of where the rules and expectations and rules are coming from. This is more centralized, at least centralized in some place, like from an organization or from a constitution of a nation. You get totalitarian regimes when you have situations where the external institutions are trying too forcefully to force their will and their values and their rules on top of an internal institution system that doesn't align very well. And when there's a whole lot of effort sort of put into forcing the external onto the internal, well, that's it can feel very oppressive to people who are under that regime. The relationship between these two things goes both directions, of course, because the internal institutions are going to shape the people who move up into these hierarchical roles in the external institution. And those people might adjust the rules to either codify the internal rules that are already being acted out, or else change the rules such that they better match the values and the social alignment of the internal rules among the people here. So there is this two-way relationship where sometimes you do have companies, for example, hiring external organizational change workers or change consultants to come in and try to figure out, if you want to impose a new set of rules, how do you get people sort of emotionally on board? How do you get them to take up a new set of values that they were previously not trying to enact? And then these internal rules are going to influence the external rules by holding back change, for example, or by shaping change in the external rules according to what's going on here. So the alignment between these two things is really important in sort of the corporate sector, but not just the corporate sector. It's really any institution, including, higher education, marriage, markets. Any institution needs to be aligning these two things as they evolve. And with internal institutions, you actually get natural change that might even start at the water cooler. Like if you have a couple of popular people in the company who are at the water cooler and they're really annoyed at a colleague and they're sort of complaining about that, that knowledge of people's annoyance at that one habit in the workplace might spread such that anyone who does that little annoying thing gets the stink eye. Well, that's a mechanism of enforcement, and the rules were formed by the annoyed coworkers at the water cooler. That enforcement gets portrayed, it gets perpetuated if people in the company think it's useful to give someone the stink eye every time they do that thing. And in that way, these rules can naturally spread through a population. And of course, there is utility to that oftentimes because it's sort of like that's an annoying habit. If nobody did that, then we would have smoother, better interactions. So it would structure interaction in potentially a better way. But of course, it can also be oppressive if you're, for example, enforcing it only among people of a certain type. Internal institutions can involve in-groups and out-groups in a way that can be not very helpful. Internal institutions can also be ambiguous, such that people don't really know, oh, is this the social norm? How harsh will the social punishment be if I violate this social norm? New people may not know these social norms. So there's a way that internal institutions can be in some ways oppressive in their own right, and having the external institutions sort of helps lay out the rules such that it's easier for people to come in who don't know the social setting, such that nobody is unfairly punished for something that they just didn't pick up on in the social setting. So both of these have advantages and disadvantages. How explicit this can protect rights from being violated by the norms that are set up in internal institutions. It could be that there's a rule that everyone would love if it were enforced, but there's nobody in the organization who's assertive enough to actually enforce that rule, in which case taking something that people value in their hearts and turning it into an external institution can assign someone a role, and maybe they get paid a little extra if they are the ones in charge of enforcing certain things. And then, of course, when they enforce those, people don't think, oh yeah, they're mean. They're like, oh yeah, I'm so glad someone's enforcing this value that we all hold, that we're just too shy or too agreeable to actually enforce. As you might imagine, internal institutions work really well with smaller groups, but as groups get bigger and more diverse, and as there's more sort of departments with specialized economic roles, it gets harder and harder to have the internal institutions enforcing everything that needs to be enforced. So that's where the external institutions come into play and sort of structure the relationships perhaps between different departments with different internal cultures and internal rules, roles, and enforcement mechanisms.